Ethan Grayson prided himself on being a practical man. At 36, he had built a stable life, a modest suburban home, a thriving career as a software engineer, and a marriage to Claire, a woman he had loved since their college days. But lately, cracks had begun to appear in the foundation of their seemingly perfect life, and they gnawed at him in ways he couldn't shake. Their mornings together were once filled with shared coffee, easy laughter, and a rhythm of togetherness that felt unbreakable. But now, Claire often left the house before Ethan had even woken up, her mornings consumed by impromptu meetings and calls that demanded her attention. "I have to get ahead of the workload," she'd explain with a breezy smile that never quite reached her eyes. Ethan tried not to read into it, but it was hard to ignore how her priorities seemed to have shifted. Claire had always been ambitious, a trait he admired in her. But in the past few months, it felt like her ambition was pulling her away, not just from their shared routines but from him entirely. His suspicions began with the little things. The way Claire started spending more time on her appearance before work, often wearing outfits that seemed designed to draw attention. The late nights that stretched into early mornings. Her newfound habit of leaving her phone face down on the table or carrying it with her everywhere, even into the bathroom. "You've been working so hard lately," Ethan mentioned one evening as they sat across from each other at the dinner table. "You should let me take you out this weekend. Just the two of us. A date night like we used to." Claire's fork paused mid-air, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. "I don't know, Ethan. I might have to prep for Monday's presentation. Maybe another time." Her words were casual, but Ethan couldn't ignore the familiar twinge of rejection. He forced a smile and nodded, but the feeling of being sidelined had taken root. One afternoon, while clearing out a drawer in their bedroom, Ethan came across a dress he didn't recognize, short, black, and far more provocative than anything he'd ever seen Claire wear. "Is this new?" he asked later, holding it up when she came into the room. Claire glanced at it and shrugged. "Yeah, I bought it for the office party next month." "It's nothing." Ethan hesitated. "It's a bit daring, isn't it?" Claire frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It's just a dress, Ethan. Don't make it a thing." But it was a thing, whether she acknowledged it or not. Ethan couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was amiss. One night, after Claire had fallen asleep, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The thought had crossed his mind a dozen times, but tonight it felt inescapable. What if she's hiding something? The idea chilled him, but it also lit a spark of determination. He wasn't the kind of man to jump to conclusions, but he also wasn't blind. If there was something going on, something that threatened the life they had built, he needed to know. The next morning, as Claire kissed him goodbye, Ethan watched her leave with a mix of love and unease. He resolved to find the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The day of the corporate party dawned with a cool, clear sky, but Ethan couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him like a storm cloud. Claire had been unusually chipper, bustling around the house with an energy that felt foreign. She'd been like this for weeks, more animated, more preoccupied, as though a new and secret world had opened up to her. "Ethan, can you grab the dry cleaning for me?" she called from the bedroom, where the faint sound of the closet doors sliding open and shut punctuated the morning stillness. He folded the newspaper on the kitchen counter and glanced at his watch. "Sure. Is it just the suit?" "And my dress," she replied, her tone light but edged with something he couldn't quite place. Ethan's stomach twisted. He hadn't forgotten the dress, short, sleek, and revealing in ways Claire had never cared to be before. He fetched the clothes and laid them on the bed, catching sight of her as she emerged from the bathroom, a towel wrapped around her damp hair. "Thanks," she said with a distracted smile, brushing past him to examine the dress. She ran her fingers along the fabric as though it were a prized possession, then hung it carefully on the door. Ethan lingered, watching her. "You're really wearing that tonight?" Her hand froze mid-motion, and she turned to face him. "What's wrong with it?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "It's just, don't you think it's a bit much for a work party?" Claire's brow furrowed, her lips curving into a frown. "It's a party, Ethan. A corporate party. Everyone dresses up." "Yeah, but," he gestured vaguely at the dress, its hemline hovering closer to scandal than sophistication. "Isn't this different for you?" She crossed her arms, tilting her head in that way she did when she was preparing for a fight. Different how? You've never been one for flashy outfits. It doesn't seem like you. Her frown deepened, her tone sharpening. So now you're the expert on what seems like me. Since when did my wardrobe need your approval? It's not about approval, Claire, Ethan said, exasperation seeping into his voice. I just think this dress might give the wrong impression. Claire's eyes flashed. The wrong impression, she repeated, her voice rising. Let me guess, you're worried about what people will think of you because of what I'm wearing. That's not fair, and you know it, Ethan shot back. I'm worried about you. About how people might interpret it. Oh, give me a break, Ethan. She turned back to the dress, smoothing the fabric with unnecessary precision. I'm a grown woman, and I don't need you, or anyone else, telling me what I can or can't wear. I'm not telling you what to do, he said, his frustration bubbling over. I'm just asking you to think about how it looks. How it might come across. She spun to face him, her cheeks flushed. What it looks like is that I'm confident and proud of how I look. What it comes across as is none of your business. My body, my rules, Ethan. The phrase hung in the air like a gauntlet, the finality of her words stopping him cold. Your rules. Ethan repeated, his voice low and trembling. Fine. But don't pretend this is just about a dress. You've been pulling away for months. Late nights, secrets, and now this? What are you trying to prove? I'm not trying to prove anything, Claire snapped. I'm trying to live my life, something you wouldn't understand because you're too busy sitting in judgment. Judgment? Ethan's voice cracked with disbelief. I've stood by you, supported you, and tried to be understanding, but this isn't normal, Claire. She shook her head, her laugh bitter and cutting. You're unbelievable. God forbid I do something for myself for once. You'd rather I stay at home, stuck in the same boring routine, living life on your terms. That's not what I want, and you know it. Then what do you want, Ethan? She demanded, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. For me to wear a sack to the party? To sit in the corner like some obedient little wife while you feel superior? His chest tightened, the words catching in his throat. I want my wife back, he said finally, his voice breaking. The woman I fell in love with. The one who didn't feel the need to impress anyone but herself. For a fleeting moment, something softened in Claire's expression. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a hardened mask of defiance. I'm done with this conversation, she said, turning on her heel. I have a party to get ready for. Claire. She ignored him, slipping into the bathroom and slamming the door behind her. The sound reverberated through the house, a sharp punctuation to their argument. Ethan stood frozen, the weight of their unraveling relationship pressing down on him like a physical force. When she emerged 20 minutes later, dressed and perfectly made up, the tension between them was palpable. She grabbed her clutch and slipped on her heels, not meeting his gaze. Where are you going? He asked, his voice tight. To the party, she replied curtly, brushing past him. Without me? She paused at the front door, her hand on the knob. Yes, Ethan. Without you. I don't need a babysitter tonight. Before he could respond, she opened the door and slammed it shut behind her, the force rattling the frame. Ethan sank into the couch, his head in his hands. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of her car pulling out of the driveway. He stared at the empty room around him, the shadows deepening as night fell, and wondered when everything had gone so wrong. The hours after Claire slammed the door were some of the longest of Ethan's life. He paced the living room, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic loop of anger, confusion, and the nagging sense that he was standing on the edge of something catastrophic. He tried to distract himself, flipping through channels on the TV, scrolling through his phone, even attempting to dive into a work project, but nothing could quiet the storm inside him. His mind kept drifting back to the dress, the argument, and, most troubling of all, the way Claire had dismissed his concerns. My body, my rules, she had said. The phrase echoed in his head like a taunt, carrying with it an air of defiance that felt deeper than just the argument about her dress. It felt like a wall she had built between them, one he didn't know how to tear down. As the hours stretched on, Ethan's frustration turned into a cold, focused determination. He needed answers. Claire's laptop sat on the dining table where she had left it earlier in the day. Ethan hesitated as he approached it, his conscience warring with his curiosity. He had never been one to invade her privacy. Trust was something they had always valued in their relationship, but things had changed. He slid the laptop open, the screen springing to life. Her password was one he already knew, her childhood pet's name, and within moments, he was staring at her desktop. Most of the folders seemed innocuous, work files, vacation photos, and random documents, but one caught his eye. It was labeled simply, miscellaneous, and its placement, tucked in the corner of the screen, felt almost deliberate. His hand hovered over the trackpad. He told himself he shouldn't, that this was a violation of her trust, but the nagging doubts in his mind pushed him forward. He clicked. The folder contained a mix of files, photos, emails, and screenshots. At first, they seemed harmless enough. There were pictures from work events and casual office lunches, but the deeper he delved, the more unsettling the content became. One email thread, in particular, caught his attention. It was between Claire and her boss, David, the same man she had spent much of the previous office party talking to. The tone of the email started professional but quickly became more personal. From David Miller. Subject: Great presentation. Claire, I can't tell you how much I appreciated your input on the branding pitch. Your creativity is unmatched. Let's celebrate soon, just the two of us. Ethan's stomach churned as he scrolled further. From Claire Grayson. Subject: Great presentation. Thank you, David. It means so much to hear that from you. Drinks sound perfect, let me know when and where. The emails continued in a similar vein, their tone growing increasingly flirtatious. Ethan's hands trembled as he opened a photo attachment from David, showing a selfie of him holding 2 glasses of wine. The caption read, "This spot is waiting for you." Ethan's pulse quickened. He had to know more. Scrolling back through the emails, he found another thread that stopped him cold. It wasn't with David this time but with someone named Nate, fitness trainer. The emails were shorter but filled with suggestive language and winking emojis that made Ethan's stomach twist. He checked the timestamps. The messages to Nate overlapped with the ones to David, their dates and times suggesting she had been juggling both conversations simultaneously. As the weight of the evidence settled on him, Ethan leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding in his chest. His worst fears were being confirmed in real time, and the reality was even more devastating than he had imagined. But he wasn't done yet. Navigating back to her desktop, he opened her browser history. Most of it was benign, shopping sites, news articles, and the occasional work-related search, but one entry stood out, a reservation for 2 at an upscale restaurant downtown, made for the night before their argument. He hadn't been there. Ethan's grip tightened on the edge of the table. The timeline was falling into place, and the picture it painted wasn't just heartbreaking, it was damning. It was nearing midnight when the sound of Claire's car pulling into the driveway broke the suffocating silence of the house. Ethan closed the laptop and shoved it back into its spot on the table, his mind still reeling from everything he had uncovered. The front door opened with a clatter, and Claire stumbled in, her heels clicking unevenly against the tile floor. "Ethan," she called, her voice slurred. He stood in the hallway, watching as she fumbled with her purse, dropping it twice before managing to set it on the counter. Her makeup was smeared, and her hair hung limply around her face. The sharp, tangy smell of alcohol wafted through the air. "Claire," he said evenly, stepping closer. She looked up at him, her eyes glassy and unfocused. "What are you doing up?" "Waiting for you," he replied, his voice tight. "How was the party?" She laughed, a hollow, grating sound. "Oh, you know, the usual. Boring work stuff." Ethan's jaw clenched as she kicked off her heels, one of them landing sideways against the wall. She staggered toward the couch and collapsed onto it, her dress riding up her thighs in a way that made his chest tighten with anger. "Boring, huh?" he said, his tone sharper than he intended. Claire waved a hand dismissively. "I don't want to talk about it." "Maybe we should," Ethan said, his voice low. "You seem to have a lot going on these days." She groaned, throwing an arm over her eyes. Not tonight, Ethan. I'm tired. Let's just go to bed. But Ethan didn't move. He stood there, staring at the woman he thought he knew, wondering how long it would take for her lies to unravel completely. The living room was cloaked in an icy silence, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Ethan stood over Claire, who lay sprawled on the couch in her drunken stupor, oblivious to the storm brewing in his chest. The evidence of her betrayal, the emails, the reservations, the late-night messages, flashed through his mind in a relentless loop. He took a deep breath, the weight of his next words pressing on him like a boulder. "Claire," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut through her haze. She groaned, turning her head to face him. "What now, Ethan?" she mumbled, her words slurring. Ethan's jaw tightened. "I know about you and David." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, and for a moment, Claire simply blinked at him, her brain sluggish from alcohol. Then, slowly, realization dawned, and her eyes widened. What are you talking about?" she stammered, pushing herself upright. "Don't play dumb," Ethan snapped, his voice rising. "I saw the emails. The messages. The reservations. You've been lying to me for months." Claire's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "And don't even think about denying it," he continued, pacing the room like a caged animal. "I've got the proof. Every word, every photo, every reservation. All of it." Claire's face crumpled. "Ethan, please," she said, her voice cracking. "It's not what you think." "Don't," he roared, slamming his fist against the wall. "Don't insult me with excuses. I trusted you, Claire. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me." Tears spilled down her cheeks, her mascara smudging further. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she sobbed. "It was just a mistake. A mistake." Ethan laughed bitterly, the sound devoid of humor. "Which part was the mistake? The messages? The dinner dates? Or the fact that you threw away our marriage for some fling with your boss?" Claire buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Please, Ethan. Let's just talk about this. We can fix it." But Ethan wasn't done. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Do you know what your father would think of this?" Claire froze, her head snapping up. "Yeah," Ethan said, nodding slowly. "I'm sure he'd love to hear how his perfect little daughter has been sneaking around with her boss. Maybe I should call him right now and let him know." "Ethan, no." Claire cried, scrambling to her feet. "Please, don't. He can't, he wouldn't be able to handle it." "Oh, now you're worried about someone else's feelings." Ethan spat. "Your father deserves to know what kind of person you've become." "Ethan, I'm begging you," she pleaded, gripping his arm. "He's not well. This would destroy him." He shrugged her off, his expression cold. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you started sneaking around." Claire collapsed onto her knees, her sobs echoing through the room. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'll do anything. Just don't tell him." But Ethan's resolve was unshakable. He strode to the closet, yanked open the doors, and began pulling out her clothes. One by one, he hurled them toward the open window, the garments fluttering to the ground outside like fallen leaves. "Ethan, stop!" Claire screamed, rushing to grab at his arm, but he shoved her aside. "Get out," he bellowed, his voice trembling with fury. "Take your lies, your betrayal, and get out of my house." "Please," she sobbed, clutching at his shirt. "Don't do this. I'll make it right, I swear." But Ethan had reached his limit. He grabbed her by the arm, dragged her to the door, and threw it open. "Get out," he said through gritted teeth, his eyes blazing. Claire hesitated, her face streaked with tears, but one look at Ethan's expression told her there was no use arguing. She stumbled out into the night, barefoot and broken, as he slammed the door behind her. The next morning, Ethan called his lawyer. By the end of the day, the divorce papers were in motion. He erased every trace of Claire from his home and his life, determined to rebuild without the weight of her betrayal. For the next year, Ethan focused on himself. He poured his energy into his work, reconnected with old friends, and even started going to therapy to process the whirlwind of emotions that had consumed him. He began to feel like himself again, stronger, clearer, and ready to move forward. It was a cold, gray afternoon when the past came knocking. Ethan had just returned from a jog when he heard the doorbell. He opened the door, and there she was, Claire. Her hair was unkempt, her eyes hollow, and in her arms, she cradled a baby, a boy, no older than a few months. "Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know where else to go." He stared at her, his stomach tightening. "What are you doing here?" Tears welled in her eyes as she looked down at the child. "This is David's son. He left us. I have nowhere to go. Please, Ethan. I need your help." Ethan's jaw tightened as he looked from her to the child. A storm of emotions churned within him, anger, pity, and the faintest trace of something he didn't want to name. "Why should I help you?" he asked coldly. Claire's voice broke. "Because I have no one else. And because I know I don't deserve it, but I'm begging you, for his sake." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words pressing down on him. And then, without a word, he stepped aside, letting her in. Ethan closed the door behind Claire and leaned against it for a moment, staring at her as she clutched the baby tightly to her chest. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, taking in the familiar space she had once called home, a place that now felt foreign, as if it had been frozen in time while her life spiraled out of control. "Sit," Ethan said, gesturing to the couch. His voice was even, but his face betrayed no emotion. Claire hesitated before sinking onto the cushions. The baby in her arms let out a soft whimper, and she rocked him gently, murmuring words of comfort. Ethan watched her silently, his mind racing. The woman before him was a shadow of the Claire he once knew. Her confidence had evaporated, replaced by a fragile vulnerability. The baby, David's child, was the physical manifestation of the betrayal that had destroyed their marriage. Yet, as much as Ethan wanted to turn them both away, he couldn't ignore the raw desperation in her eyes. "What do you want, Claire?" he asked finally, his tone cold but steady. She looked up at him, her lower lip trembling. I need help, Ethan," she whispered. "David left us. He wants nothing to do with me or his son. I have no money, no family willing to take me in, nowhere to go. I thought maybe you could." "Stop," Ethan interrupted, raising a hand. "You thought I could what? Save you? Fix everything you broke?" Claire flinched, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know I don't deserve anything from you," she said, her voice shaking. "But I'm not asking for me. I'm asking for him." She looked down at the baby, her eyes filling with anguish. "He's innocent in all of this. He didn't ask to be born into this mess." Ethan's gaze softened slightly as he glanced at the child. The boy squirmed in Claire's arms, his tiny fingers grasping at the fabric of her shirt. For a moment, Ethan felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, a mixture of sadness and a deep, instinctive need to protect. "You're asking a lot, Claire," he said quietly, dragging a hand down his face. "After everything you've done, you show up here with his child, and you expect me to what? Take you back? Pretend none of it happened?" "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I don't expect that. I don't even expect forgiveness. I just need a safe place for him. I'll leave if you want, but please, Ethan, don't turn him away." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of her plea. Ethan stared at her, his emotions warring within him. He thought about the life they had shared, the love they once had, and the betrayal that had shattered it all. He thought about the man he had become in the aftermath, stronger, more independent, but also lonelier. Finally, he let out a long breath and sat down across from her. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice softer now. "What happened after I kicked you out?" Claire hesitated, then began to speak. She told him about the months she spent bouncing from couch to couch, trying to scrape together enough money to support herself. She told him about David's initial promises to help, which quickly turned into indifference and, eventually, abandonment. She told him about the nights she spent crying in cheap motels, terrified of what the future held for her and her child. "I hit rock bottom, Ethan," she said, her voice breaking. "And when I did, all I could think about was you. How I destroyed the one good thing in my life. I'm so sorry. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I needed you to know." Ethan listened silently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, his mind churning. "This doesn't change what happened," he said finally. "It doesn't erase the lies or the pain you caused. But," he paused, glancing at the baby, who had fallen asleep in Claire's arms. "It's not his fault. And it's not right to punish him for your mistakes." Claire's eyes widened, hope flickering across her face. "Does that mean?" Ethan nodded slowly. "You can stay. Both of you. But this isn't a promise of anything more than that. I'll help you get back on your feet, but you need to understand that trust takes time." Tears streamed down Claire's face as she nodded. "Thank you, Ethan. Thank you so much." In the weeks that followed, Ethan's life changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. He found himself waking to the sounds of a baby crying in the night, learning how to warm bottles and change diapers. He watched Claire rebuild herself, piece by piece, as she found work and started to stand on her own again. And somewhere along the way, something unexpected began to happen. The bitterness that had consumed him began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. He saw glimpses of the woman he had fallen in love with, the way she sang softly to the baby, the determination in her eyes as she worked to regain her independence. One evening, as they sat together after putting the baby to bed, Claire turned to him. "Ethan," she said softly. "I know I have no right to ask, but, do you think we could ever start over?" Ethan looked at her for a long moment, his heart heavy with the weight of the past. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I'm willing to try." As the months turned into years, their relationship slowly healed. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. And in time, Ethan came to love the child as his own, finding in him a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always the possibility of redemption and grace. What would you do in Ethan's shoes? Could you forgive and rebuild, or is betrayal unforgivable? Share your thoughts on this gripping tale.